I'm handing over to Sebastian now for like this session for the next 1.5 hours. He's like your guide into the world of company building, and yeah, he knows way more about that than anybody, more than me and probably more than most people in this room. So Sebastian,
Great.
Go ahead.
Thanks, Max. Nice to see you guys. Nice to see so many familiar faces. I'm glad I have this headset so that I can move around and maybe do some dance moves. I feel like Beyonce, which was always my dream. So yeah, I'll talk to you guys about LongBio. So this is a term that we coined a couple years ago, referring to the longevity biotech space. And we think it'll be useful to have this sort of shorthand abbreviation to sort of show investors and people in the space that they can work in a totally new field, kind of like what synthetic biology did with the term synbio. I hope this will be one of those buzzwords that investors know that they need to have a thesis on it in the future. So this is the outline of the talk. I'll talk a bit about my own background, why you should listen to me, about Healthspan Capital, the fund that I help run, the biotech ecosystem broadly, DeSci in the LongBio sector, how investors diligence startups and assets, which I think will be most relevant to any of you in the audience who are maybe professors or academics spinning out companies, and some reading and further resources to dive into. So my own background, who am I? Sebastian Brunemeier. I look myself in the mirror every day and ask that question. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm a geroscientist by training who has been active in the LongBio field as a biotech founder and venture investor for about 10 years. So I studied molecular neuroscience, biochemistry of aging. I worked at a bunch of different academic research institutes. I was one of the first hires at Apollo Health Ventures, which is today one of the largest aging-focused venture funds in the world. It's more of a company builder, so if you're an academic with an idea, you should definitely reach out to Apollo. They can help you launch. Within Apollo, I launched what is proudly today one of their flagship companies. It's called Samsara Therapeutics. Samsara is working on autophagy enhancement. So it's the largest drug discovery platform for small molecules that enhance autophagy, this process that's induced in fasting. And it's based in Oxford, UK. We're hiring biochemists in Oxford. And we're going into the clinic this year with our first molecule for Parkinson's and ALS. And we got a grant from the Michael J. Fox Foundation to do that. Then I co-founded Cambrian Biopharma, which will be presenting on Thursday. Cambrian is one of the larger multi-asset LongBio companies. We have about 10 assets in the pipeline, several in the clinic. So check out Cambrian, especially if you're interested in working at one of the portfolio companies of Cambrian. And I've co-founded Healthspan Capital with 2 partners, as well as ImmuneAge Bio, which is working on rejuvenating the immune system, targeting hematopoietic stem cells. So the stem cells in your bone marrow that give rise to your whole immune system. We have a method of rejuvenating them. So as an American, I get to brag a little bit. I co-founded 3 companies with a total value of over $500 million today, and invested in well over 20 companies over the last 5 years or so. So hopefully that qualifies me to tell you a little bit about how to do this. Here are some of the other organizations that I work with or advise. I want to call attention particularly to the Longevity Biotech Fellowship. If you're new to this space, this is a great community. It's kind of like ARDD, but over the course of some months, and definitely recommend checking it out. So Healthspan Capital, we're one of the only funds in the world that is dedicated to LongBio and regenerative medicine. And we are actually one of the most active, if not the most active, early-stage investors in this space. We did about 20 deals in our first year. So here are some of our colleagues who work with us, very lucky to have these around the table. They've been at a lot of the top academic research institutions and big pharmas and so forth. Here are some of our awesome portfolio companies. This is actually an incomplete list. You can go on our website, healthspancapital.vc, to see some more of them. And if you're a LongBio founder, you can get in touch. We'd like to be the first institutional investor in your company. So to give you an overview of the LongBio ecosystem, I would definitely recommend going to longevitylist.com. This is a website made by my partner at Healthspan, Nathan Cheng, who co-founded the Longevity Biotech Fellowship. On longevitylist.com, you can see a list of many of the companies in the space, the investors, even job postings. And he has aggregated this list, and the number of companies referring to themselves as LongBio is actually rising very rapidly. I would say not all of these companies would qualify as true LongBio. That's something that we're going to see in the future as LongBio becomes more of a buzzword or becomes more hot or there's a bubble in it. A lot of companies are going to clout chase and claim to be LongBio when they actually lack that critical longevity data. So anyway, here's a snapshot of the Longevity List website. You can also subscribe to Nathan's excellent newsletter. It's the most read newsletter in the space, Longevity Market Cap newsletter. So here's some of the investors and company builders and early stage investors. So if you're interested in launching a company, you should know about these groups. Here are some of the sort of prominent names. So I call this my social proof slide or an appeal to ethos, some of the smart cookies who've been investing in the space. Vitalik Buterin, founder of Ethereum, was mentioned recently. He and VitaDAO co-organized Zuzalo, this 2-month experimental pop-up city in Montenegro. Peter Thiel, of course, who's been in this for a long time, but many other very smart cookies and some big pharmas. So here's a non-exhaustive list of some of the companies in the space, both public and private. The private companies are probably more true blue LongBio than the publicly listed ones. And you can see some of Apollo's portfolio companies here. So to give you an overview of how this whole machine works in biopharma is what I call a wiring diagram of the biomedical economy. So we can zoom in, and all of the money ultimately comes from the public. Through taxes, you pay money into the NIH. That's about $50 billion a year now. Goes to fund universities. They do biotech startups. Venture capital can sometimes build these new startups. We also have risk capital coming in from investments in the public markets, as well as into limited partners investing into venture funds. So then that all sort of converges on the biotech startups who do preclinical and early clinical development and then partner or license their assets to big pharma who does the later stage development. And then the CROs, contract research organizations, work for both biotechs and pharmas to do this critical proof of concept work and clinical work. You then provide the data to regulators, and then the regulators decide to approve, and then the payers like insurance or governments will pay for it or not, and then it's up to the doctors to prescribe. So there's some bad news in this space, which is big pharma is declining in R&D productivity precipitously. So they're actually burning their investors' capital when they spend it on internal R&D. But when pharma acquires non-organic external innovation, acquiring biotech companies, the success rate is actually a lot higher. It's about 8 times more efficient per dollar to get a drug approved by biotech as a sector than big pharma. And we can sort of opine about why that may be, but that is the challenge. Big pharma historically has been asleep at the wheel. So according to Jürgen Drews, the head of R&D at Roche, one of the more sophisticated of the big pharmas, he said, biotech is taking up what pharma is neglecting, carrying out future-directed research, discovering new classes of medicines that attack more directly the root causes of disease. What could be more at the root than aging itself? David Baltimore, the president of Caltech, Nobel laureate in immunology, said, regarding biotech in the 90s, pharma was asleep at the wheel, unable to understand the profound opportunities in molecular biology and unable to take advantage of them. So companies like Genentech arose in their place. The good thing is big pharma seems to be faster on the uptake this time with LongBio, but still not fast enough. So here's some good news. Shifting from big pharma internal R&D to decentralized biotech sector means that the R&D efficiency is much higher. So this data comes from Andrew Lowe's group, who analyzed it from Royalty Pharma. They found that in the year 2000, the top 30 best-selling drugs, most of which came from internal pharma R&D pipelines. Only 13% were from academic spinouts or biotech. But if you fast forward to 2018, the assets in blue here, 80% came from academia and biotech. So there's been this sea change, and I think that's only going to accelerate. The problem, though, is that there's this valley of death, there's this bottleneck where it's really hard to just get started. The first couple of financing rounds, pulling together a team, spinning these assets out of academia is still quite difficult. And the very good news, also coming from Andrew Lowe's group, is that clinical trial success rates are rising rapidly. And Andrew Lowe himself speculates that this is due to better understanding of the molecular pathology of disease, so going after rare genetic diseases, where we know exactly what gene is broken versus a complex disease, and more academic spin-outs in biotech companies which are more efficient with capital. And so Andrew Lowe's work instigated the creation of a company called BridgeBio, which is a very large $6 billion plus company, working on taking assets out of academia and developing them for rare diseases. And that model inspired us at Cambrian to do the same thing as BridgeBio, but the same sort of decentralized model, but with aging as the focus. So shifting gears to DeSci, you guys have heard several lectures on DeSci, so I won't belabor the point. But what if we could combine this distributed discovery model like we have at Cambrian and BridgeBio with DAOs, Web3, and crypto markets to reduce the barriers to entry for capital formation? So right now, Wall Street or the City of London has this near monopoly on aggregating capital and distributing it to deserving companies. But what if we didn't have that bottleneck? So here's the landscape of some of the companies in this space. A more up-to-date graphic was shown, but you can find this somewhere on the internet. So what is DeSci? This is one definition I came up with a couple years ago. DeSci is a new paradigm to discover, disseminate, fund, and execute scientific research without relying on governments, big corporations, and centralized organizations. So the on-chain IP resulting from this research can be fractionalized and liquidly traded in a manner more transparent than the current IP market structure. And companies and labs can be financed on-chain via DAOs. So the decentralized approach mitigates the enforcement of scientific dogma, like we saw with the amyloid beta Alzheimer's situation, and perverse incentives in both industry and academia, which have failed in their obligations to public health and scientific progress. If you follow Peter Thiel or Tyler Cohen, there's this technological stagnation hypothesis that something happened in the 1970s and the rate of technological progress has slowed dramatically. So everybody in the 50s and 60s thought it would be inevitable that we had flying cars and we would have a moon base and we would have cured aging by now. And something happened in the 70s that really put a damper on scientific progress. Anyway, so how do investors look at these assets to spin them out? So we source the new IP, so we'll look in journals or conferences like this, and just you can get in touch with us. We do preclinical diligence, so we look at your top figures, the publications, et cetera. We help you come up with an IP strategy, so how do you actually patent and protect these assets? The most important, strongest type of patent is a composition of matter patent, where you're making a new chemical entity, a new thing that doesn't exist in nature. Then we come up with a development plan, so a budget, a Gantt chart, if you're doing medicinal chemistry on small molecules, and the experiments for probably about 2 years at a time. It's important to have clinical and regulatory strategy, so for an early stage startup, you don't need to know 100% what your lead clinical indication will be, but you want to at least have some sort of list of ideas. And then when you have all of that in place, it's appropriate to speak to your tech transfer office, spin out a company, and you want to pre-negotiate the deal terms there. And organizations like VitaDAO or HealthSpan can help you interface with those tech transfer offices. So I personally look across these 3 major categories: pharmacology, geroscience, and commercialization. So what is the mechanism of action of the drug? Is it targeting a hallmark of aging? Is the target known? What's the therapeutic index? So how toxic is this molecule relative to its effective dose? The small molecule, how complex is the structure to synthesize? The geroscience aspect, so median and maximum lifespan extension, reversal of aging in various phenotypes, so cognitive function, physical function, et cetera, and that it works in multiple animal models of disease, not just one, because no one animal model of disease is very predictive. And then we check out the lab, the strength of the IP, and so forth. So one of the key points that I think should be obvious but isn't is what qualifies as a LongBio company. There are many companies out there referring to themselves as such, but they're lacking some of that critical data, which is lifespan extension data. To be a longevity company, you have to extend lifespan in some model organisms, and the mechanism of action should be one of the hallmarks of aging. If you do not yet have a lifespan curve shift, that's okay, but you're not fully a longevity company, in my view. And there will be many companies that are trying to ride the wave of the LongBio movement, but if we have these companies that are claiming to be LongBio but don't have that evidence, it's actually harming all of us because, I don't know about you, but I'm in this for the drugs that extend my lifespan and my loved ones in the world. And so the amount of capital and attention that goes to companies that are not likely to succeed in that actually detracts from those who will. So we have an important quality control role to play. This is a Kaplan-Meier curve. You guys will notice you can take the delta between the median and the maximum lifespan. And that ratio is very important to us. So we source through these kind of conferences and journals, so you guys can attend those. Your tech transfer office will sometimes do some of the work for you, reaching out to investors. Grant databases, we sometimes look through those, and then if you can just get in touch with us through a warm intro. And sometimes if you're a masochist like me, we'll go through the patent database. But what I found is that Big Pharma is not actively out there talking to people. Big Pharma, a friend of mine works at Pfizer, and she said that there are only 12 people in all of North America doing search and evaluation for Pfizer. Given how many universities there are in America, they're definitely not saturating the field. Here's some books that I definitely recommend. So this is, I'd say, my most important slide for those of you who are contemplating launching a company in the near term. I can actually send you PDFs of these, although the first two are available for free online. Entrepreneur's Guide to a Biotech Startup and the Spark Guide to Academic Drug Discovery. The Genentech one is just kind of a personal favorite because it's really inspiring to see what it was like to build one of the largest and most successful biotech companies in history. And it was really quirky group, they were taking psychedelics, back in the lab, and it was really just a sort of fun story, so check that book out. Here are some of the other resources I'd recommend, so specifically on geroscience, some of the outlets and newsletters, biotech podcasts broadly, more biotech news outlets, some of the top journals. Check out Aging Biology, a new journal from Vera Gorbanova et al. I wanted to give her a shout out, and some of these other drug discovery journals. And then for some of these texts, these books about how does venture capital work, you can get in touch with me on LinkedIn, and I actually have a Google Drive folder that contains many PDFs of these kind of books to get you started. So we'll skip through that. So we look at a lot of different parameters. I mentioned some of these. You want to really bone up on your pharmacology and toxicology. If you're a basic scientist, you're probably more in the biochemistry and genetics side, but the pharmacology, toxicology will be really critical. I actually have this Gantt chart here that shows the steps down to minute detail of what it will take to actually launch a company and who you should hire and so on. So get in touch with me if you want to access that checklist. So an important factor that academics don't spend that much time thinking about is intellectual property. So IP law is an art, not a science. You want to plan for success that your patent will be disputed in inter-parties review once the drug is nearing the market. So you want to cover your bases. So the ideal situation is you have a composition of matter patent. So you have a new chemical entity. You've done some medicinal chemistry and made a better version of, say, a natural product. VitaDAO and other groups can finance you to do some of that work. And ideally, you also find the molecular target. This is very important. I'll repeat this again. Don't file the patent too early. A lot of academics, this is probably the number one mistake academics do, is they file a patent because they want to publish the paper. And that can be a big problem because the patent will go stale. Patents only have a 20-year lifespan, and it will tick 5 or 10 years before you're close to the market. So what you should do is file a patent for a close chemical analog, not the compound that you're ultimately going to develop clinically. This is some details. The first patent you file is usually rejected, so don't worry if that happens. And there are ways, even if your patent is going stale, there are ways to recover it. And another advantage of doing biologics, actually, is that you can get 12 years of marketing exclusivity independent of any patent. So just to double down on that, academics prematurely file patents to publish. Do not patent your best compound too early. Publish an analog, otherwise it will go stale. Many companies die because of this problem. You can also come up with an RNPV model. This is a little more sophisticated, but you basically calculate what the valuation of your company or your asset should be worth based on the success rate of compounds or drugs in that specific therapeutic area, as well as the stage of development. Then you can come up with an RNPV model, financial model that basically tells potential investors or pharma partners what the asset should be worth. And then you want to come up with before that, you want to come up with a development plan, budget, and a Gantt chart. So I want to give a shout out to Longevity Prize. So this is a cool new initiative for academics to basically submit an idea. It can be something that has been in the literature for a century, but people sort of didn't realize it or ignored it. So to give you one example, Irina Conboy some years ago at Stanford basically revitalized or revived the parabiosis work. So when you surgically link the circulatory systems of an old and a young mouse, the old mouse gets a bit younger and the young mouse gets older. Well, that technique had been used for, I don't know, maybe a century before, and then it fell out of fashion. She brought it back. And so there's a lot of science that is in these academic journals or known, maybe in a different language, that we should revive. So you can submit a hypothesis for what is a very cool, underappreciated area of geroscience that we should pursue. And you can be paid. You can get, I think we're up to 20 grand or something for the first prize. And it's just for the idea. You don't have to carry out the research. But if you do win and you want to carry out the research, then it helps. So I'll give a quick plug for ImmuneAge Bio. This is my latest company. We are the first drug discovery platform for immune system rejuvenation. We target the hematopoietic stem cells in the bone marrow. So these HSCs give rise to your whole immune system, as well as your red blood cells. And it turns out when you do a young to old bone marrow transplant, aged mice can live up to 30% longer. And there are no negative side effects of this, unlike, say, rapamycin or even metformin, which do have a known side effect profile. If you can just isolate and rejuvenate your own HSCs, your autologous bone marrow, and then reinfuse a turbocharged, tuned-up, refreshed version, we think that is one of the lowest hanging fruits and highest potential impact areas. Here are some of the team members that I'm lucky to have around the table, many colleagues I've worked with before. And if you're interested, if you're an investor, get in touch with me. And I want to give a shout out to some of these organizations, VitaDAO, Molecule, and LabDAO, that are really driving the DeSci movement forward. And then finally, vitalism. So some of my friends, Nathan Chang and Adam Greaves, are creating this political/religious movement around longevity. So it's sometimes said that humans, we have a religion-shaped hole in the human psyche. So we evolve to be religious, many people, and we tend to replace that with something else. Maybe it's, some political movement or another, or like, your fascination with Apple products or whatever, a sports team. And we would like to just sort of insert longevity in that missing sort of psychological need. We think there are worse things that you could do than try to allocate more societal resources to longevity and good health. And if you think about it, the US government, for example, spends about $1 trillion a year on the military. And it turns out that other countries or terrorists or whatever are not the greatest threat to your life and well-being. It's actually aging and disease. Of course, I'm preaching to the choir. So what if we allocated more societal resources to funding longevity and really investing in our health? So that's what this vitalism movement aims to do, in addition to this sort of network states neo-governance movement about creating new jurisdictions that are friendly for longevity, new blue zones, and places that are fun for investors and founders to hang out. So check out vitalism.io, read the white paper. They're doing a congress soon, and would definitely recommend getting involved. So with that, thank you guys for listening. I think we have some time to take some questions. So yeah, cheers. So no question is too stupid. Yes, in the back.
So there's a wide variety of the quality in tech transfer offices.
Yeah.
I wonder, is there any kind of index or database that ranks that? I feel for a lot of prospective PhD students, this might be some criteria that they would want to consider.
Yeah, so the question is there a ranking of tech transfer office quality? Is that the question? Sure. So there is an organization called AUTM, AUTM, which is the Association of Unity Technology Transfer Managers. And they do have these kind of leaderboards of how much revenue each one generates, how many deals they do, et cetera. But it's really hit or miss. There's a lot of turnover. The top institutions usually have pretty good tech transfer offices, but the most prestigious institutions in Boston, San Francisco, San Diego, that kind of thing, their TTOs will become a little bit more like prima donnas and difficult to work with. So yeah, it's really all over the map. But yeah, if you have any specific question in mind, I'm happy to address that now or later. Yeah, Vera.
Yes, so you mentioned that, well, we want to go for those companies that would, those studies that measure lifespan as a part of their development. But then very often when you come to this point of, actually forming a company, and then the question comes, okay, what will be the indication, right? And it would not be the lifespan. So where are we now, and what do investors think? Would they go for lifespan as indication or a biomarker, or still we would have to find some disease?
Of course, yeah, that's a critical question. So when I talk to people who are like traditional pharma people, they'll say, well, yeah, all of this is great, but aging is not a prescribable indication. So a doctor can't write you a prescription for aging. They can do it off-label. Many people I know take metformin, acarbose, rapamycin off-label, but it's not yet something that insurance will reimburse for. So we're working on that. Having aging on the label, I think, will probably take maybe a decade or something. But in the meantime, the solution is actually not that complicated, which is you have a lead indication, an initial indication, sometimes called a stepping stone indication, where you get it into the clinic, you get human proof of concept, and then you can do label expansion to many different indications after that. The hardest part is just getting it available on the market for humans, and then you can have academic researchers, clinicians doing their own small pilot clinical studies to generate indicative data, and then you can do the larger studies later. So that's the current solution, is that stepping stone strategy. Oftentimes, a lot of investors like easy clinical indications as the lead, so like rare genetic diseases, where regulators notice that this is a neglected area historically by big pharma, not really anymore. And so they roll out the red carpet for you and make it easier to get approval with these rare and neglected indications. So a lot of people do that first and then label expand to larger indications after. Did that answer the question? Okay, cool. Good. Any other questions or limericks? We also have my good friend and colleague Tim here from VitaDAO who can address any questions on VitaDAO. So I'd say one of the best ways to get started is to get your initial capital from VitaDAO to do the proof of concept within academia or through one of our CRO partners, and that can be enough to justify launching a company. So there are many assets or projects that are just not quite there, and with a couple $100K of research would be in a position to launch a company. So maybe Tim, if you want to elaborate.
Actually, I had a question
Sure.
on the, I mean, you and I both, and I think a lot of us believe in this idea that to be a true LongBio company, you have to do a lifespan experiment, and I think preferably right in a healthy animal. The problem is pharma may not care about that because they care about a disease. So how do you how can you help companies, academics, basically get that data funded so that, yeah, they can actually meet the criteria of longevity by investors such as yourself?
Sure, yeah. This is a critical point as well. So if you want to raise money from LongBio investors, it really helps to have some lifespan data. It doesn't have to be in mice initially, but in some multiple species. It doesn't have to be that expensive either. I mean, it's getting cheaper. There are more groups providing these aged mice. Shout out to Olden Labs as well. But yeah, pharma mostly cares about specific indications. But pharma, actually, the pharma folks I have talked to, they are intrigued by lifespan data because they don't see it every day. They see people banging their head against the same wall with the same, Mouseheimer's amyloid beta model or their bleomycin fibrosis model or whatever. And so when they see something new, their ears do perk up. And the other cool thing about a lifespan study is it's like a really good toxicology study, because most drugs is kind of like an open secret in the field. Most drugs are somewhat toxic. The very word pharmacology derives from pharmakon, the Greek, which means poison. So a small amount of a drug is good for you in some instances, but too much is toxic, obviously, we all know that. But if you give most drugs in the pharmacopoeia to a mouse, do you think it's going to increase or decrease their lifespan? It's going to decrease, because most drugs work by inhibiting some essential function of biology. So if you have a drug that actually extends their lifespan, enhances robustness, you can be reasonably sure that it's not going to be toxic in humans as the standard drug. So they do like to see it, but But yeah, hopefully some years in the future, everybody will be asking for the longevity study. Cool. Okay, good. So, yeah, any last questions? Otherwise, that's it. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much.